Helix Station hung in the darkness of space like a city made of metal and light, spinning slowly against the backdrop of 1,000 distant stars. And within its massive corridors walked creatures from 100 different worlds who had come to trade and talk and sometimes argue about the price of fuel or the boundaries of territory that stretched across galaxies. No single species could ever fully explore. Danny Cole wiped the grease from his hands with an old rag that had seen better days, humming a tune his grandfather used to sing back on Earth, back in Montana, where the sky was blue and the mountains touched the clouds, and nobody had ever heard of plasma conduits or alien diplomats or stations that floated between the stars like islands in an ocean of nothing. He was 34 years old and had spent the last 8 years fixing things that broke on Helix Station, which meant he fixed things every single day because something was always breaking, always sparking, always leaking some fluid that probably should have stayed inside whatever pipe or tube or container it came from. His supervisor, Linda Marsh, walked up behind him and tapped his shoulder with the datapad she carried everywhere like it was attached to her hand by invisible string. "Got a special job for you today," she said, and her voice carried that tone Danny had learned to recognize over the years. The tone that meant the job was going to be difficult and probably thankless and would involve someone looking down at him like he was dirt on their expensive boots. "What kind of special?" Danny asked, turning to face her with the rag still in his hands. "Valoran ship just docked at Bay 12, Linda said, and she watched his face carefully as she spoke the words. "They hit a debris field and need cooling system repairs before they can continue their journey." Danny let out a low whistle because everyone on the station knew about the Valoran, those ancient beings who looked like dragons from the old Earth stories, 12 feet tall with scales that shimmered in colors that human eyes could barely process. And they breathed fire that burned hotter than plasma torches, and they looked at other species the way a king might look at ants crawling across his dinner table. "They actually asked for human help?" Danny said, genuine surprise in his voice. "They did not ask," Linda replied with a small shake of her head. "They demanded, and Station Command agreed, because nobody wants to insult a species that could probably burn this whole station to ash if they decided we were not worth keeping around." Danny nodded and gathered his tools into the warm bag he had carried since his first day on the station, the bag his father had given him before he left Earth, telling him that a good mechanic could fix anything if he had the right tools and the patience to figure out what was broken. The walk to Bay 12 took him through corridors filled with beings of every shape and size, some walking on two legs like humans, others floating on cushions of gas or sliding along on dozens of tiny feet. And Danny nodded to the ones he recognized and stepped aside for the ones who looked like they were in a hurry to be somewhere important. When he reached Bay 12, he stopped and stared at the ship that filled the docking area like a cathedral made of dark metal and glowing crystals, its hull covered in patterns that seemed to move when he looked at them from the corner of his eye. And standing at the entrance were two Valoran guards who towered over him like living statues carved from obsidian and fire. "Human mechanic," one of them said, and the words came out in a deep rumble that Danny felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. "You will repair the cooling systems in Section 7, and you will touch nothing else, and you will speak to no one unless spoken to first." "Understood," Danny said, keeping his voice calm and respectful, even though part of him wanted to point out that he had been fixing things since before this guard was probably hatched. He walked past them and into the ship, and the air inside was warm and dry and smelled like smoke and something else he could not name, something ancient and powerful that made the hair on his arms stand up. The cooling systems were exactly where the guards had said they would be. And Danny set to work with the quiet focus that had made him one of the best mechanics on the station, his hands moving through the repairs with practiced ease while his mind wandered to thoughts of home and wonder at the strange beauty of the alien ship around him. Had been working for about 2 hours when he heard a sound that made him stop and listen. A high chirping noise that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the ship, somewhere beyond the section he had been. Told to stay in, Danny knew he should ignore it and keep working and mind his own business, the way Linda always told him to do when dealing with species who did not want human interference in their affairs. But the sound came again, and this time it sounded almost like crying, like a child who was lost or scared or both. And Danny Cole had never been very good at ignoring the sound of someone who needed help. He set down his tools and moved quietly toward the sound, his footsteps soft on the metal floor, his heart beating a little faster as he passed through a doorway marked with symbols he could not read. And there, in the dim light of a cargo hold filled with containers and equipment, he saw her. She was small, no bigger than a large dog, with scales that sparkled like jewels in shades of purple and gold. And her eyes were huge and bright and filled with curiosity as she played near a cluster of fuel lines that Danny recognized immediately as the most dangerous part of any ship of Valoran Hatchling. He realized probably no older than a human toddler, and she was poking at cables and pipes with her tiny claws while making happy chirping sounds that echoed off the metal walls. Danny looked around for her caretaker and spotted an elderly Valoran standing near the cargo hold entrance. His attention focused on a heated conversation with one of the repair coordinators, completely unaware that his young charge had wandered into a restricted area. The hatchling looked up and saw Danny watching her, and for a moment they just stared at each other, the small dragon and the human mechanic. Two beings from worlds so different they might as well have been from separate universes. Then she chirped at him and went back to playing with the fuel lines. And Danny felt a cold knot form in his stomach because he knew exactly how dangerous those lines could be. If something went wrong, he needed to tell someone, needed to warn the caretaker that the little one had wandered somewhere she should not be. But he also remembered the guards at the entrance and their warning about speaking to no one unless spoken to first. Danny returned to his workstation and found Linda on the communication channel, her face appearing on his small screen with the usual expression of someone who had too much to do and not enough time to do it. "There is a hatchling playing near the fuel lines in the cargo section," Danny said quietly. "Someone needs to know." Linda sighed and rubbed her eyes with one hand. "Danny, you know we cannot interfere with Valoran family matters. It is against protocol, and it could cause a diplomatic incident. But she could get hurt," Danny said. "The Valoran have been raising their young for millions of years," Linda replied. "They do not need a human mechanic telling them how to watch their children. Just finish the repairs and come back to the bay." The channel closed and Danny stood alone in the warm air of the alien ship, the sound of that small chirping voice still echoing in his memory. And somewhere deep in his gut, he felt something that might have been a warning or might have been fear or might have been both. He went back to work, but he could not stop thinking about those bright eyes looking up at him from the shadows of the cargo hold. The explosion came without warning, a thunderous roar that shook the entire ship and sent Danny stumbling against the wall as sparks flew from conduits above his head and emergency lights began flashing red in every direction. He grabbed his tool bag and ran toward the exit, his training taking over as his mind raced through the possibilities of what could have gone wrong and how bad the damage might be and whether he could make it to the safe zone before the bulkhead sealed and trapped him inside a ship that might be about to tear itself apart. Corridor ahead of him was filling with smoke and heat, and he could see other beings running in the same direction, their faces twisted with fear As they pushed past each other in their desperate rush towards safety, Danny rounded a corner and saw the source of the disaster. A ruptured plasma conduit that was spewing superheated fire into the corridor, like a dragon breathing death into the heart of the ship. The flames so bright they hurt his eyes, and so hot he could feel them blistering his skin even from 20 feet away. Everyone moved to Section 3. Someone was shouting over the emergency speakers. Bulkheads closing in 60 seconds. Danny turned to follow the crowd towards safety when a sound cut through the chaos and stopped him cold. A high-pitched wailing cry that he recognized instantly because he had heard it just hours ago. In the cargo hold, the hatchling he spun around and looked through the wall of plasma fire that blocked the corridor. And there, in a small pocket of clear air on the other side, he could see her. The little Valerin with her purple and gold scales now pressed against the wall as far from the flames as she could get. Her tiny mouth open in a scream of terror that tore at something deep inside his chest. The child. A deep voice roared behind him, and Danny turned to see the elderly caretaker Varth standing at the edge of the flames, his massive body trembling with anguish as he stared at the fire that separated him from the hatchling he was supposed to protect. "Can you reach her?" Danny shouted over the noise of the alarms and the roaring flames. "No." Varth cried, and his voice broke with despair. "If I breathe fire to clear a path, it will ignite the fuel vapors and cause a second explosion that will kill us all. I cannot save her. I cannot." More Valerin were gathering now, their huge forms crowding the corridor as they watched the flames with expressions of horror and helplessness. And Danny understood with terrible clarity that these powerful beings, who could burn through metal with their breath, were completely unable to save one of their own children. The wailing grew louder and more desperate, and Danny could see the little one trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear into the wall behind her as the flames crept closer and the heat grew stronger and her time ran out second by second. Looked at the fire and then at the emergency panel on the wall beside him, where a standard fire suit hung in its case, the kind of suit every station worker knew how to use. The kind of suit that was designed for minor emergencies and small fires, and definitely not for walking through plasma flames that could melt steel. His colleague Kevin Page grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the safe zone. "Danny, we have to go. The bulkheads are closing in 30 seconds. "There is a child in there," Danny said, his eyes still fixed on the small form behind the flames. "The Valerin will figure something out," Kevin said. "They are ancient and powerful, and they do not need us to save them." "She is not ancient," Danny replied, pulling his arm free. "She is a baby." He walked to the emergency panel and pulled out the fire suit. And Kevin watched with wide eyes as Danny began pulling it on over his work clothes. The protective material already feeling thin and inadequate against the heat that poured from the corridor ahead. "That suit is rated for 30 seconds in plasma fire," Kevin said, his voice rising with alarm. 30 seconds, Danny. And that is being generous." "Then I better move fast," Danny said, as he sealed the helmet and felt the cool rush of recycled air against his face. The Valerin parted before him as he walked toward the flames, their massive bodies stepping aside in silence as this small human in his flimsy suit approached a fire that none of them could enter. And Danny heard Vorath whisper something in the Valerin language that sounded like a prayer or a curse or maybe both high. Matriarch Kethrani pushed through the crowd and stopped when she saw what was happening, her golden eyes widening as she watched the human mechanic stand at the edge of the inferno that held her granddaughter trapped. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp with disbelief. Danny turned to look at her, and through the visor of his helmet she could see his eyes, calm and determined and completely without fear. "I'm going to get her," he said simply. "You will die," Kethrani said. And it was not a warning, but a statement of fact delivered by someone who had lived for centuries and knew Exactly what plasma fire did to flesh and bone. Maybe, Danny replied. But she will not. He did not wait for a response, did not pause to reconsider, did not give himself time to think about all the reasons why what he was about to do was impossible and foolish, and likely to end with his body burned beyond recognition. He simply walked forward into the flames, devouring, watched in stunned silence as the small human disappeared into the fire, swallowed by plasma and heat and light that should have killed him in the first step. And Vorath fell to his knees with a moan of grief, because he had seen warriors and heroes and champions of a dozen species, and none of them had ever done what this mechanic was doing. Now Kathrani stood frozen, her ancient mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed, because in all her long years she had never seen another species willingly walk into certain death to save a devouring child. The flames roared and twisted and consumed the corridor, and somewhere in their heart a man was burning and a child was crying, and time itself seemed to slow down as the universe held its breath. Kevin Page stood at the edge of the safe zone with tears streaming down his face, counting the seconds in his head and knowing that each one brought his friend closer to death. The bulkhead warning blared again. 15 seconds to seal, and still the flames burned. And still there was no sign of the man who had walked into them. And the Velen began to keen in low voices as they mourned both the hatchling and the human who had tried to save her. 10 seconds to seal. Kathrani closed her eyes because she could not bear to watch anymore, could not stand to see the flames that were consuming both the child of her blood and the stranger who had shown more courage than any being she had ever known. 5 seconds. And then the bulkhead exploded outward as a burning figure crashed through it and collapsed on the deck, smoke rising from a suit that had melted into unrecognizable slag, skin visible through the holes where the protective material had failed completely, but clutched against his chest. Wrapped in his arms, shielded by his body from the worst of the flames, was the hatchling Syra, her scales unmarked and her eyes wide with shock, but her small body completely unharmed. The bulkhead sealed behind them with a final boom, cutting off the flames, and in the sudden silence, the only sounds were the soft chirping of a frightened child and the ragged breathing of the man who had saved her. The world came back to Danny in pieces, fragments of sound and light that drifted through the darkness like leaves floating on a slow river. And he tried to open his eyes, but they felt heavy and distant, and somehow not entirely connected to the rest of him. He could hear voices speaking in languages he did not recognize, could feel hands touching him with gentle care, could smell something clean and medicinal that reminded him of hospitals back on Earth, where his mother had worked as a nurse before the sickness took her when he was just a boy. Pain came next, spreading across his body like fire, remembering where it had touched him. And he gasped and tried to move but found that he could not. Found that his body had become a prison of bandages and tubes and machines that beeped in steady rhythms beside whatever bed he was lying in. Easy, a voice said, and he recognized it as belonging to a human. A woman whose face slowly came into focus as his eyes finally agreed to open. You are safe, Danny. You are in the medical bay, and you are going to be okay. The woman was wearing the uniform of a station doctor, and her name tag said Martinez. And she was looking at him with an expression that mixed professional concern with something that looked almost like awe. The girl, Danny managed to say, and his voice came out as a rough whisper that hurt his throat. The little dragon, is she okay? Dr. Martinez smiled and nodded. She is perfectly fine, not a single scale harmed. Thanks to you. Danny let his head fall back against the pillow and closed his eyes again. And for a moment he just breathed and let the relief wash over him like cool water on burned skin. You have been unconscious for 3 days. The doctor continued. Burns over 40% of your body. but the Valoran insisted on helping with your treatment. And I have to say their medical technology is something else entirely. Danny opened his eyes again at that. Surprised by the information. The Valoran helped me? Helped you? Martinez laughed softly. Danny, they have not left this corridor since you were brought in. Their High Matriarch has been standing outside your door for hours at a time. And the little one you saved has tried to sneak in here at least a dozen times, as if summoned by the mention of her name. There was a commotion at the door, and Danny turned his head to see a small purple and gold-formed dart between the legs of a much larger Valoran who was trying unsuccessfully to catch her Syra scrambled across the floor and jumped onto the bed beside Danny, her tiny claws careful not to touch his bandages as she pressed herself against his side and made soft chirping sounds that seemed to communicate relief and joy and gratitude all at once. Syra. The larger Valoran called out, and Danny recognized the voice of Varth, the elderly caretaker whose failure to watch his charge had started this whole chain of events. You cannot be in here. The human needs rest. But Danny lifted his least bandaged hand and placed it gently on the hatchling's head, feeling the warmth of her scales and the vibration of her happy chirps. And he smiled for the first time since waking. Up she can stay, he said. Varth stopped at the edge of the bed and looked down at Danny with eyes that held depths of emotion Danny had never expected to see in a Valoran face. Shame and gratitude, and something that might have been the beginning of respect. I failed in my duty, Varth said, his deep voice heavy with regret. I was supposed to protect her, and I let myself become distracted, and she wandered into danger because of my carelessness. Children wander, Danny replied, his hand still resting on Syra's head as she nuzzled against his palm. It is what they do, no matter what species they are. But you saved her, Varth continued. You walked into fire that would have killed any of us, fire that should have killed you. And you brought her back. Why would you do this? Danny considered the question, thought about all the complicated answers he could give about duty and courage and the value of innocent life. But in the end he settled on the simple truth. She was scared, he said. And she was alone, and I could help, so I did. Varth stared at him for a long moment. And then the ancient Valoran did something that Danny would later learn was almost unheard of among his kind. He bowed his head in a gesture of genuine respect. I am in your debt, human, Varth said. A debt I can never repay. You do not owe me anything, Danny replied. But Varth shook his head. You do not understand, the old Valoran said. Among my people, what you did is Moorism. It is sacred. You passed through flame to save a child, and that act carries weight that cannot be measured in gratitude or gifts or words. The door to the medical bay opened again, and this time the figure who entered had to duck to fit through the frame, her scales gleaming like molten gold in the artificial light, her presence filling the room with an authority that made even the air seem to stand at attention. Matriarch Kethrani walked to the side of Danny's bed and looked down at the human who had saved her granddaughter, her ancient eyes studying him with an intensity that made Danny feel like she was reading every thought he had ever had. Syra chirped excitedly at the sight of her grandmother. But she did not leave Danny's side, instead pressing closer to him as if to show the matriarch that she had chosen where she belonged. You are awake, Kethrani said, and her voice was softer than Danny had expected, lacking the cold authority she had used when speaking to him before. I am, Danny replied, meeting her gaze without flinching despite the pain that throbbed through his body with every heartbeat. I have lived for 900 years, Kethrani said slowly. I have watched empires rise and fall, have seen species evolve and go extinct, have witnessed miracles and catastrophes that your human histories will never record. She paused, and something in her expression shifted, became almost vulnerable in a way that seemed entirely foreign to her nature. In all that time, she continued, I have never seen anyone do what you did. Not Valrin, not any of the elder races. Not the warriors or heroes or champions who fill our legends with their deeds. I just did what anyone would do, Dani said. But Kathrani shook her head. No, she replied firmly. That is exactly what you did not do. Anyone else would have run to safety. Would have told themselves that the child was not their responsibility. Would have found 1,000 reasons why walking into plasma, fire was foolish and pointless and certain to fail. She reached down and gently stroked Syra's head. Her massive clawed hand somehow tender against the small hatchling's scales. But you did not run, Kathrani said. You did not calculate your chances or weigh your options or consider what you might lose. You simply saw a child in danger and you acted. Dani did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. And the silence stretched between them until Syra broke it with a soft chirp that seemed to carry all the things that words could not express. I must ask you something, Kathrani said finally. And I need you to answer honestly. Okay, Dani said. When you walked into that fire? She asked. Were you afraid? Dani thought about the question, remembered the moment when he had stood at the edge of the flames and looked into the inferno that he knew would probably kill him. Yes, he admitted. I was terrified. Kathrani nodded slowly, and something like a smile crossed her ancient features. Good, she said. Courage without fear is merely foolishness, but fear overcome by purpose, that is something else entirely. That is what makes heroes. She straightened and looked at Varth with an expression that conveyed instructions without words. And the elderly Valrin nodded and slipped quietly out of the room. Rest now, Kathrani told Dani. When you are well enough to walk, we will speak again. There are things that must be done, rituals that have not been performed in millennia, but they will be performed for you. She turned and walked toward the door, but paused at the threshold and looked back at the human lying in the bed with her granddaughter, curled against his side. You have changed things, she said. More than you know, more than you can imagine. The galaxy will not forget what you did here. And then she was gone. And Dani was left alone with Syra and the beeping machines and the strange feeling that his life would never be the same again. 2 weeks passed before Dani could walk without help. 2 weeks of healing and rest and visits from colleagues who looked at him like he had grown a second head. 2 weeks of Syra sneaking into his room every chance she got and curling up beside him while he slept. Kevin Page came by every day after his shift, bringing news from the station and snacks from the human quarter and stories about how Dani had become the most famous person on Helix Station without even trying. You should see the news feeds, Kevin said one afternoon, sitting in the chair beside Dani's bed while Syra dozed against Dani's leg. They're calling you the Dragon Walker, the Flame Runner, the human who should not be alive. Those are terrible names, Dani said with a small laugh that hurt his healing ribs. I did not make them up, Kevin replied with a grin. But the point is that everyone is talking about you. Not just on the station, but across the whole sector. Human news networks have been running your story non-stop. And diplomats from species I have never even heard of are asking questions about humanity. Dani shook his head and looked down at Syra, her small form rising and falling with each peaceful breath. I did not do it for attention. I know, Kevin said. And his voice became more serious. That is what makes it such a big deal. You did not think about politics or fame or what people would say. You just saw a kid in trouble, and you acted like it was the most natural thing in the world. It should be, Dani replied. Any decent person would have done the same. Kevin was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft. No, Dani, they would not. I was there. I saw the fire. I felt the heat from 20 feet away. And I grabbed your arm and tried to pull you towards safety because every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. He leaned forward in his chair. his eyes meeting Danny's with complete honesty. I am not a coward, at least I did not think I was. But I would not have walked into those flames, not for anyone. And that is the truth. Danny did not know how to respond to that. So he just nodded and let the silence say what words could not. The door opened and Linda Marsh walked in. Her datapad clutched against her chest like always. But her expression was different than usual. Softer somehow and touched with something that might have been pride. Got a message from the Valerin delegation, she said. High Matriarch Kethrani requests a private audience with you as soon as you are able to walk to the conference chamber. I can walk, Danny said. And he proved it by slowly swinging his legs over the side of the bed and standing up. His muscles protesting but holding steady, Syra woke at the movement and chirped in alarm. Jumping down from the bed and pressing against Danny's leg as if afraid he might disappear if she let him out of her sight. The little one can come too, Linda said with a small smile. The matriarch specifically asked that Syra be present for the meeting. The walk to the conference chamber took longer than it should have. Partly because Danny's body was still healing, and partly because every few steps someone stopped to stare at him or thank him or ask if they could take a picture with the human who had walked through fire. Syra stayed close to his side the entire way, her small claws clicking on the metal floor as she matched his pace, occasionally chirping at strangers who got too close, as if warning them to keep their distance from her. Firefather, the conference chamber was a large circular room with windows that looked out into the endless dark of space. And when Danny entered, he found it occupied by a single massive figure who stood, silhouetted against the stars. Kethrani turned to face him as he approached. And Danny noticed that she was alone, no guards or advisors or attendants. Just the ancient matriarch and the small human who had saved her granddaughter. Please sit, she said, gesturing to a chair that seemed to have been brought in specifically for human use. What I have to say will take some time. Danny sat and Syra immediately jumped into his lap, settling there with a contented chirp as if this was exactly where she belonged. Kethrani watched the interaction with an expression Danny could not quite read. Something between amusement and wonder, and a deep ancient sadness that seemed to have nothing to do with the present moment. Among my people, she began, there exists a bond more sacred than family, more binding than blood, more powerful than any oath or promise or treaty. She paused and looked out at the stars, her golden scales reflecting their distant light. It is called the debt of flame. And it is created when one being passes through fire to save the life of another. I have heard of it, Danny said. Voreth mentioned something about rituals. Kethrani nodded slowly. The debt of flame was old when my grandmother was young. Old when the first Valerin ships left our homeworld to explore the stars. Old when the universe itself was still learning what it wanted to become. She turned back to face Danny, and her eyes held a weight of history that made him feel very small and very young. In all that time, she continued, the ritual has been performed perhaps 100 times. Always between Valerin, always for acts of courage that defied explanation. Always for those who proved themselves worthy of being called kin to Dragonkind. Danny felt Syra shift in his lap, her small body pressing closer as if she sensed the significance of what was being said. Never once, Kethrani said, has the ritual been performed for an outsider. Never once has a non-Valerin been marked as one of us. Never once has someone from another species been deemed worthy of carrying the flame. She stepped closer to Danny, her massive form casting a shadow that engulfed him completely. Until now, what exactly does this ritual involve? Danny asked, and he was proud that his voice remained steady despite the pounding of his heart. It is called the marking, Kethrani explained. I will breathe fire upon your arm, not the destructive fire of battle, but the sacred fire of binding. And where it touches you, it will leave its mark forever. Will it hurt? Danny asked HFY, considered the question. The fire will not harm you. That is part of the ritual. Part of the magic that has been passed down through generations beyond counting. But the marking itself will change you, will make you something you were not before. Change me how? You will become kin to Dragonkind, HFY said simply. Bound to us in ways that transcend species and biology, and all the barriers that separate beings from one another. Our enemies will become your enemies. Our allies will become your allies. And any who harm you will answer to the wrath of the entire Valoran nation. Danny looked down at Syra, who was watching her grandmother with wide eyes that sparkled with understanding beyond her years. And if I refuse? He asked, not because he intended to, but because he wanted to understand the choice fully. Then you will still have my gratitude and my respect. HFY replied, and you will be free to return to your life as it was before. No Valoran will think less of you for declining an honor that was never meant for your kind. Danny thought about Montana and the mountains and the blue sky he had left behind so many years ago. Thought about his father's tool bag and his mother's gentle hands and all the simple things that had made him who he was. Then he looked at Syra, at this small creature who had somehow become precious to him in ways he could not explain. And he knew that his answer had been decided the moment he walked into the flames. When do we do this? He asked it. HFY smiled, and for the first time Danny saw warmth in her ancient eyes. Tomorrow, at the station's main plaza, before witnesses from every species present on Helix Station, the galaxy will watch as a human becomes dragon. Syra chirped with joy and nuzzled against Danny's chest. And somewhere deep inside him, a fire began to burn that had nothing to do with plasma or pain. A fire of belonging and purpose, and something that felt remarkably like coming home. The main plaza of Helix Station had never been so crowded. Beings of every shape and size packed into every available space, standing on balconies and hanging from structural supports and pressing against barriers that had been erected to keep a clear path from the entrance to the center where a raised platform waited beneath lights that made everything look golden and sacred. Danny stood at the edge of the crowd with Kevin and Linda beside him, wearing simple clothes that HFY had sent to his quarters that morning. A sleeveless shirt that left his right arm bare, and pants made from fabric that felt like silk against his healing skin. You ready for this? Kevin asked, and his voice carried a mixture of excitement and nervousness that mirrored what Danny felt in his own chest. Not even a little, Danny admitted. But I'm going to do it anyway. Linda placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed gently. Your parents would be proud of you, Danny. Whatever happens today, I want you to know that. Danny nodded but could not speak. His throat tight with emotions he did not have words for. Deep horns sounded across the plaza, a tone that seemed to vibrate in Danny's bones. And the crowd fell silent as the Valoran delegation emerged from the opposite end of the space. They walked in formation. Dozens of massive dragon-like beings moving with a grace that belied their enormous size. Their scales catching the light in shimmers of gold and red and deep purple. Their eyes fixed straight ahead as they approached the platform. HFY walked at the front, her golden scales blazing like a sun brought down to walk among mortals, and beside her walked little Syra, her small form barely reaching the matriarch's knee, but her presence somehow commanding attention equal to any adult. The crowd parted before them like water flowing around stones. And when they reached the platform, HFY climbed the steps and turned to face the assembled masses, while Syra remained at the bottom, her bright eyes searching the crowd until they found Danny. She chirped loudly and bounced on her small feet. And Danny could not help but smile despite the solemnity of the occasion. People of Helix Station, HFY's voice boomed across the plaza, amplified by technology, but needing no enhancement to carry the weight of authority. People of every world and every species gathered here today. You have come to witness something that has not happened in the memory of any living being. She paused and let her gaze sweep across the crowd. Touching briefly on representatives of species Danny did not recognize. Ambassadors and traders and travelers who had come from across the sector to see this moment. You have come to witness a human receive the mark of flame. A murmur ran through the crowd. Whispers in 100 languages expressing shock and disbelief and curiosity. And Danny felt the weight of countless eyes turning toward him. "Danny Cole," Kethrani called out. "Step forward and claim the honor you have earned." Danny walked through the crowd, and the beings parted before him just as they had parted for the Valoran, bowing their heads or nodding in respect as he passed. And by the time he reached the platform steps, Syra had run to meet him and was bouncing around his feet with joyful chirps, climbed the steps, and stood before Kethrani, feeling impossibly small next to her towering form. And she looked down at him with eyes that held the wisdom of centuries and the warmth of genuine affection. "Kneel," she said softly. And Danny lowered himself to one knee, his bare right arm extended before him. Kethrani began to speak in the ancient Valoran tongue. Words that Danny could not understand but could somehow feel. Syllables that resonated with power and meaning that transcended language itself. Sounds that had been spoken since before humanity learned to walk upright on their distant blue world. The other Valoran took up the chant, their deep voices joining together in a harmony that made the air itself vibrate with energy. And Danny could feel something building around him. Something ancient and vast and impossibly beautiful. Thrani's chest began to glow. Light building behind her scales, like a star being born inside her body. And when she opened her mouth, the fire that emerged was unlike anything Danny had ever seen. Golden and warm and somehow gentle, despite its obvious power, the flame touched his arm and Danny gasped. Not from pain, but from the sensation of warmth spreading through his entire body. Warmth that felt like coming home after a long journey. Warmth that felt like his mother's embrace and his father's pride in every good thing he had ever known, concentrated into a single perfect moment where the fire touched his skin. Patterns began to form, golden lines that traced themselves from his wrist to his shoulder in shapes that resembled scales, and flames and symbols that might have been words in a language older than the stars. The chanting reached a crescendo and then stopped suddenly, leaving a silence so profound that Danny could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Kethrani lowered her head and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the plaza. "Rise, Danny Cole, kin of the Valoran, brother of flame, protector of the young." Danny stood and looked at his arm, at the golden marks that glowed softly against his skin, at the evidence of a bond that could never be broken. "Let all who witness know," Kethrani announced, "that this human is now and forever part of Dragonkind. Any who harm him harm us all. Any world he calls home is under our protection. Any enemy he faces the wrath of the Valoran nation." The crowd erupted in sound. Cheers and applause and exclamations of wonder mixing together into a wave of noise that washed over Danny like a physical force. Syra launched herself at him, scrambling up his body until she could wrap her small arms around his neck, chirping directly into his ear with a joy so pure it made tears spring to Danny's eyes. "Firefather," she said. And Danny realized with a start that she was speaking words he could understand. Words that the mark somehow translated directly into his mind. "My Firefather." "Yeah," he whispered back, holding her close with his newly marked arm. "That is me." The ceremony's consequences rippled across the galaxy in the days and weeks that followed. Human diplomats finding doors opening that had been closed for generations. Trade agreements being reconsidered, and treaties being proposed, and species who had ignored humanity for centuries suddenly expressing interest in building relationships. Kevin said it was like Danny had accidentally become the most important human in history just by being a decent person. And Danny told him to shut up and help finish the repairs on deck 72 months later. Danny was back in the maintenance bay, his arm glowing faintly golden beneath his work sleeve. His tool bag opened beside him as he worked on a faulty cooling unit that had been giving the residential section trouble for weeks. The door opened and small feet clicked across the floor, followed by a familiar chirping that always made Danny smile. "The Throne of Embers is docking for resupply," Sierra announced, her vocabulary having grown remarkably since she started spending time with Danny. "Grandmother says you are invited to dinner." Danny set down his wrench and scooped her up with his marked arm, settling her on his hip the way he had seen human parents carry their children. "Tell your grandmother I would be honored," he said. Sierra nuzzled against his chest. "She says you work too much. She says you are Velrin now and should not have to fix things." Danny laughed and picked up his wrench again. "Someone has to keep this station running, and besides, I like fixing things." Kevin walked by and paused at the sight of the human mechanic with the dragon hatchling, the golden marks glowing on his arm as he worked, and shook his head with a grin. "Still cannot believe you are dragon royalty now," Kevin said. "Kin," Danny corrected. "Not royalty, there is a difference." "Sure there is," Kevin replied. Walking away with a laugh, Danny returned to his work. Sierra perched on a nearby crate, watching him with adoring eyes. And somewhere in the vast darkness of space, the Velrin fleet sailed among the stars, knowing that one of their own lived on a small station in a quiet corner of the galaxy. A human who had walked through fire for a crying child and emerged changed in ways that would echo through history. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the largest ripples. Sometimes a single moment of courage changes everything. And sometimes a mechanic from Montana becomes something that the universe will never forget, because that is what humans do. They see someone hurting and they help. They see someone scared and they comfort. They see fire and they walk through it. And the galaxy is only just beginning to understand what that means.